Welcome, everyone. I'm Elliot Gaskins, Managing Director at Share Our Strength. And with so much going on in the world today, we're so glad that you've decided to spend some time with us for what we hope will be a thought-provoking conversation on food justice discussion today. Thanks, as always, to our Aspen partners at Food and Society at the Aspen Institute. You'll hear from Mary Castillo at the end of today's discussion. Thanks also again to my amazing Share Our Strength colleagues for helping make this series possible. Community Language Collaborative are joining us today to provide live simultaneous interpretation and chat transcription. Access the audio option by just clicking the interpretation icon found at the bottom of your screen. We'll also have time at the end for Q&A, so feel free to add questions or comments in the chat throughout today's discussion. In our country today, approximately 90% of its wealth is held by 2% of the nation's wealthiest. I'll repeat that. Approximately 90% of our country's wealth is held by 2% of the nation's wealthiest. That vast income inequality leaves a significant number of children and families with not enough to eat and struggling to feed their families. That is why public benefit programs have been a critical lifeline to help fill in gaps. Today, they are more important than ever. When President Roosevelt signed the Social Security Act in 1935, it set the basic model for our public welfare framework. During that time, he was reported to have said, "I see 1/3 of our nation ill-housed, ill-clad, ill-nourished. The test of our progress is not whether we add more to the abundance of those who have much. It is whether we provide enough for those who have too little." Unfortunately, as these programs grew and expanded, misinformation, stereotypes, and distorted perceptions have shaped who can actually benefit from them. In addition, barriers to accessing these programs have only exacerbated generational poverty in this country. In this session, we're not only going to dig into these various issues, but uncover solutions and outline things we can all do to ensure families have access to these critically important programs. I'd now like to introduce you to our terrific panel. We'll put their full bios in the chat so you can learn more about their incredible work. First, I'd like to introduce you to our wonderful moderator, Alexis Fernandez-Garcia, Senior Program Director, Safety Net Code for America. Welcome, Alexis. Now I'd like to introduce you to Yolanda Gordon, Senior Associate Expansion and Advocacy, Results. Thank you, Yolanda, for being here. Also welcome Parker Gilkinson, Senior Policy Analyst, Center for Law and Social Policy. Welcome, Parker. And last but not least, Gabriel Sanchez, Rubenstein Fellow, Governance Studies, the Brookings Institute. Thanks to all of you for being with us today, and thanks all of the listeners for joining us. Alexis, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, thank you, Elliot, and good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're located. I'll thank the organizers for bringing us together, but our panelists as well for allowing me the privilege of facilitating this conversation. So given the theme of our discussion, I'm going to start off with a grounding question for all of our panelists, and then I'll follow that up with some individual questions to keep the discussion going and encourage my panelists to jump in, raise your virtual hand, or flag me down if you'd like to build on a previous panelist's response or add on in any way. We really want to keep the discussion flowing naturally. So with that, let's get started. So for decades, the safety net programs like SNAP, Medicaid, and subsidized housing have provided crucial support for individuals and families with low income. They've also been used to reinforce white supremacy. So I'll ask all of my panelists today, how has the history of social welfare been intertwined with our nation's history of racism and oppression? And I'll ask Parker to kick us off, Gabriel, and then Yolanda So Parker?
Thank you for that question, Alexis. So there are multiple examples of specific policies that still exist today and their roots in racism. So for example, as a racialized system of forced labor, we can talk and go all the way back to slavery and how that paved the way for what we now know as work requirements, pretty much by popularizing stereotypes about Black people, particularly to justify their forced labor for more than 200 years. So creating a narrative that people experience in poverty, particularly Black people, needed to be forced to work. And despite the reality that African Americans were more consistently a part of the nation's working class over a more extended period of time than any other social, ethnic, or racial group, these untrue stereotypes that question the work ethic of Black people have continued to be pervasive and setting the tone for even harmful myths that contributed to to FDR's administration's deliberate exclusion of Black people from the New Deal era policies, which have created the modern public benefits programs today as we know it, which have also created the white middle class of today that many people of color were left out of.
Thank you for having me on this wonderful panel, this rockstar panel of experts to discuss these important issues. I mean, I think when we talk about the historical context, we know that the impact of racism on safety net policies has been well documented for some time by researchers. I think my colleagues might talk about other aspects of the historical context. So I want to focus specifically on what we know about voters' attitudes and how race undercuts or really contextualizes their views on whether extending benefits to others is a good idea. Researchers, including myself, who work with surveys, have consistently found for some time now that primarily but not exclusively white voters, when they're thinking about expanding access, contacting public officials in terms of expanding access, their underlying racial attitudes, including who is really deserving of these resources, really plays into that narrative. Most recently, this has also included underlying stereotypes about immigrants. And like so many other structural inequalities, it's important to note that the pandemic did not create these issues, right? It only shed light on them. And unfortunately, we're seeing contemporary examples of this historical context playing out today. I'll focus on just one example for the sake of time, and that's really the current debates regarding cash assistance for COVID relief programs. I feel that it reflects the ongoing issues we're talking about historically, with many legislators and other leaders across the country really questioning whether we can trust poor people who might be given access to direct cash payments to make sound decisions on what they do with these funds to support their own families. In closing on this issue, we've actually done some polling on this in New Mexico and have actually asked families directly who have gained access to cash assistance how they use these funds. Not surprising to any of us on this webinar, but hopefully helpful to inform policymakers. A robust 68% of respondents indicated that they use the cash assistance to pay for basic living expenses such as food, gas, and clothes. Almost another third said they use the funds to pay off overdue bills, including housing to remain in their homes. So I think hopefully that makes clear that unfortunately we're seeing examples of historical context playing out right now, but we have evidence to push back on that racist narrative. And hopefully some of this data is helpful for that effort.
Thank you. This question could be an entire webinar, I feel. But to kind of piggyback off of Parker, we have to realize as a country that the plantation was the birthplace of capitalism. We have to look at it from that perspective, because at one time, enslaved people were worth more than banks, factories, and rail combined. So we have to look at it from that perspective. The other thing that I want to point out is that language seems to be the way that politicians are really good at spinning things. So I am one of the people that I can say that personally, I received safety net programs when I was in college, when my children were small. But I don't think that safety net is the appropriate way to discuss this any longer. Welfare we've heard it for decades. Safety net programs, we continue to hear this, but when are we going to start talking about people's basic needs, the basic needs that they need to survive? And I think that changing the language that we use to talk about basic needs will shift the narrative just slightly for people to understand that, everyone has the same basic needs. Everyone's basic needs need to be met. And I also want to say that, I feel that until we talk about accessing basic needs, the current culture that we have to villainize people that live at or below the poverty line is going to continue. So until we shift the narrative to be about basic needs, what I call the four walls: food, rent, housing, electric, AC, heating. You can even throw in there those that have to pay for water. Until we start having those very basic conversations, it's still going to be a way for politicians to tweak the way that we talk about safety net programs.
So thank you all for already some thought-provoking responses. I very much appreciate kind of the linkages between historical context and where we are today. And Yolanda, I actually want to follow up on this topic of language and how we talk about services, basic needs, and how they're met. When we talk about welfare reform, we're often talking about implementing rules and systems that are meant to narrow the scope of programs with terms like work requirements, which Parker, you mentioned, family caps, resource limits. And you mentioned, this language being rooted in some stereotypes and racial biases about who is poor and why. How do we change that? And how do we change the narrative around who is accessing these basic needs supports? And let me leave it there and let you kind of respond. And then Parker and Gabriel, if you want to jump into.
So the first thing that we need to do is understand that the language that we use around safety net programs is rooted in racial bias. We have to call it out for what it is. And with the narrowing of the scope of who can access these basic needs, you narrow the amount of people that can access. So it is very intentional the way that it's done. And when we think about language, Lee Atwater was very clear that by narrowing the scope, you affect more Black people and you also harm some white people. But he considered that as collateral damage. Like, in order to get to what we need, we have to accept that some white people will be harmed in the process. And also, you can see this around the recent debate about the child tax credit and work requirements. There should not have been a conversation about work requirements attached to a child tax credit, especially during a time when most families are struggling trying to figure out, if schools shut down today, how will my child be taken care of? So we should, as a country, have been looking at how to provide a basic need to families that don't have access. And the last point that I want to, just point out is that in this country, we have a very serious issue with limiting economic security and mobility. We do this thing that we've done for hundreds of years, that if we make poverty uncomfortable, then people will get out of it, kind of like the bootstrap mentality, instead of thinking about helping people grow. Families cannot respond to a shock if they have no savings. And I think we saw this several years ago where people didn't even have $400 to respond to an emergency. So imagine individuals that are now seeing inflation go up, gas prices go up, and they only make so much money and their wages aren't going anywhere. So, as a country, we need to start considering how counterproductive policies really deter economic mobility. And we also need to start having the conversation about why it also deters ownership in our country.
Thank you, Yolanda. Parker,
Yep,
you might
I
have
can
something to
jump
add?
in next. Yep, yeah. So we know that media portrayals of groups of people help to determine their place in the economy and in the democratic process. So I want to frame that because I think what Gabriel said earlier was so important about voter attitudes. So therefore, it's no coincidence that media portrayals of people experiencing poverty shifted from white women and their children during the New Deal era to garnish support for the New Deal, right? And it shifted to Black women during the civil rights and welfare rights movement to substantiate cuts and policy changes to the program. So it's important to understand, just as Gabriel was talking about voter attitudes, that there have been specific media campaigns, including that of the welfare queen, to put out false media narratives about people who are receiving public benefits. And that within itself has created such a shame and a stigma around who receives public benefits that oftentimes folks don't even want to admit that they've needed help in this way, or that they've actually went and applied for benefits. So the real folks who actually receive public benefits are a wide array of people, right? I used to be a social services eligibility worker in the state of North Carolina, and I worked with many families, many individuals who are amazing people, honorable, and just have fallen on hard times. And we have to really talk about the economic realities in this country, where I remember having a client that fell deeply into poverty based off of having an issue happen to their car that cost $75. Right? $75 when you don't have family members who could loan it to you, when you don't know anyone, when you don't have the availability to get a loan, right? $75 doesn't seem like a lot of money, but when your mode of transportation is taken away, you may live in a more rural area and you can't make it to work any longer. That right there could tumble anyone into deeper poverty. And I think that in order for us to move forward and actually create programs that better serve people, we have to look at not necessarily who is receiving public benefits to try to paint a picture of people, but we have to actually look at what people are going through and what we in this country will allow, right? To be able to not, or make people feel they have to pull themselves up by their own bootstraps, right? That is such a unrealistic term, even within itself, literally. Yeah, so I say that instead of looking at who is receiving, we have to look at what are the circumstances that are causing people to end up in periods of extreme poverty, and also even folks who are right at the line where $1 could take you over and now you lose a net loss of benefits that really affects your family as well.
Yeah, my colleagues spoke very well on this, so I won't add too much more to their excellent answers, but I think to follow up on Yolanda's point about the language we use, we consistently find in messaging when you shift things away and you talk about hardworking families, right, that have fallen on tough times, or hardworking families that unfortunately, due to no actions of their own, find themselves unemployed in this very rough economic downturn that we know communities of color are bearing the brunt of. That reinforces not only to folks that might not be with us on this issue when we're trying to persuade, but to the populations that we're hoping will take advantage of these resources when they desperately need it. On Parker's point, when we think about this, right, I think making sure that we're stressing the stigma issue that I'm finding across a lot of our studies is definitely impacting a lot of folks who never thought in a million years they would be in the situation that they're in to have to think about reaching out for public assistance. And the more we combat some of this, this negative language, not only is it hopefully going to move more people towards our side of the issue, but I think for a lot of families out there, and I'll tell you, I've seen it in the data, who basically will say, you know what, I need these resources right now, but that's for other people. That's not for hardworking people like me. That I think speaks to this other issue, right? The bigger issue that we're seeing across the country more than anything. And just to put some data to Yolanda's point about the very, very little safety net nest egg that families have right now, just recently, this is a recent survey that I think stresses the fact that for a lot of families across the country, they're still in the middle of the pandemic, despite a lot of positive things moving. Economically, a lot of folks are not back on their feet yet. Across the Latino, Native American, and African American communities that we've surveyed, the vast majority have only $1,000 or less in their savings account because they burned through all of it already in the last 2 years. And unfortunately, over a third of Latinos have $100 or less right now to really lean on in these tough times. So unfortunately, we remain in a very difficult time, and we're all going to have to acknowledge and own that. We're not quite ready to turn the corner, at least economically, on this thing.
Yeah, I appreciate the note on how fragile our economy is for many kind of participants of that economy, and how close they can be to themselves needing to meet these basic needs. And so, Gabriel, I want to go back a little bit to a comment you made and kind of shift the conversation a bit to access. And I want to ask you a question specific to immigrant communities and thinking about, the choice to access, but I'm going to use that loosely because often there are barriers that don't make that a choice. And so I want to talk a little bit about barriers too. But before we get there, even though the public charge rule has been reversed, there's still a culture of fear in immigrant communities that's keeping eligible families from accessing basic need benefits. Can you talk about why this fear persists and what we can do about it?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that question, because I was hoping to be able to speak to this issue. I'm fortunate to oversee a large national survey of immigrants, including mixed status families, for protecting immigrant families that was focused on this particular public charge rule. I reference PIF for protecting immigrant families because I believe they have a toolkit available on their webpage for folks that want to dig more deeply into this and use some of the messages I'll reference briefly in my response. But the main take-home message from that study was, unfortunately, that what we often refer to as the chilling effect associated with the public charge rule remains a major barrier to accessing basic needs or resources. I'll say that again, basic needs or resources. Thanks, Yolanda, for that helpful word shift away from safety net. I caught that mid-sentence, and I want to use the language to reinforce that point. But unfortunately, even though the law was reformed and done away with, I think on day one of the Biden administration, roughly half the sample of immigrants that we spoke with had basically told us directly that although they were in need of assistance for themselves or for their family, they specifically chose not to pursue it due to concerns and fear about their immigration status or that of their family. When we dug a little bit deeper on this, we found that the vast majority of immigrants in the US are not aware that the law has shifted. So very basic information to reverse this trend is needed. And we know that in addition to just lack of basic information, we're also unfortunately working against misinformation campaigns that generate fear and concern across our networks. And really, we're also dealing with a significant lack of trust in government, both federal and state governments and other public institutions right now, that make it more difficult for all of us to help inform members of the community, because even if they hear that information, there's a significant leap from hearing it to trusting. And I think, we all have to work together to combat that. Fortunately, the survey provided a lot of very strong messaging that was tested to utilize to help inform the community, particularly immigrants who we know are most directly impacted. I'll share just two highlights of that might be helpful to folks that work in this space. One is we found that messages that specifically highlight what policies we're talking about not being impacted by the public charge rule, SNAP, for example, is very useful and effective. I think people need to hear the specifics in order for them to grasp onto this and trust the information that they're hearing. And we also found that being specific with the resources that are available to families who make that risky proposition to apply for funds has positive traction with immigrants and their families. For example, referencing directly up to $300 monthly for tax child credits is a good example of being very specific of what's available to folks and not using aggregate millions or tens of millions. Be direct on what's available to individual families at their level, I think is the way to go about doing it. And in closing, the good news from that study is that after being informed by the content from the survey about the public charge rule, interest in applying for resources jumped substantially among respondents. So we know that if we can get the information out to immigrants and their families, we know it's going to work and help them get connected to the resources that they need.
Thank you for that. Parker, Yolanda, anything? Because I'm about to shift topics just a little bit. Okay. So I want to talk about challenges that people face accessing benefits, kind of a follow-up, Gabriel, to this comment around perception and why some of these challenges for immigrant communities might lead people to make certain choices, but for all eligible people, talking about accessing benefits. And I'll start by sharing just a little bit of kind of a Code for America example where we launched the Get Your Child Tax Credit tool. And so we saw that the child tax credit, and I think Yolanda, you had mentioned this, really played a critical role in reducing poverty in this particular moment, but yet we didn't really maximize it. We could have reduced poverty significantly more if eligible people had accessed the benefit as they should have. But we quickly realized, this isn't a simple task. So in context of the child tax credit, we know that not everyone interacts with the tax system. And in fact, most of people who are most in need are least likely to interact with the tax system. If you earn little or no money, you may not have never filed a tax return, or you may have even been told repeatedly not to do so for reasons related to your benefits. And so our Get Your Tax Credit effort really aimed at addressing this directly by creating kind of simplified filing tools targeted at this population. We dropped daunting parts of the process that just were not relevant. And we really focused in on a simplified process, but even that wasn't enough. You can't just have a great tool. We needed widespread outreach. We needed credible messengers and community to tell people about the tax credit and its availability. And we still have room to improve. This coming year, we're thinking about how to do that even better because we have a gap that needs to be filled. And so I share this kind of to tee up this next topic. And Parker, I'll start with you. How can government, in partnership with the communities they serve, address barriers to access? How can we make our basic needs services and benefits more accessible and equitable for all people?
Absolutely, that is a great question. So I have a newly released report that has a lot of answers to this. So I'll go ahead and shout that out because I worked on it for over a year. Oh my gosh. But it's titled SNAP Program Integrity, How Racialized Fraud Provisions Criminalize Hunger. And so at the end, I discussed a multitude of solutions that would help ultimately make our safety net more accessible, equitable, and work towards being anti-racist. So in the report, I discuss cultural changes that need to take place at state agencies. I throw it into multiple buckets, but this is one that a lot of us advocates don't really focus on, but a really major part of why folks see it being difficult to access public benefits, because the workers at agencies have been placed in, difficult positions, but sometimes they can come off as extremely rude. They treat people not the best, and people are there experiencing long wait times, the amounts of paperwork and verification and documentation that has to be sent. Some of these agencies are not using internet, and I say not using internet in terms of being able to submit your verifications, where you still can't email a verification. You have to come in person to submit it. And we used to call it at my agency the black box, because if it goes in that box, you may never see it again, right? And no one knows that you submitted it because it just goes into an empty box that's time-stamped. But if they lost it, and that's it. And you may not be able to get access to benefits. So like I said, I talk about cultural changes. I also mention legislative and administrative changes that need to happen. And most importantly, I talk about how as a society, we have to admit the harm that was done by the original Social Security Act in its exclusion of people of color, along with other governmental policies and initiatives, including welfare reform, including work requirements and horrible treatment by state officials, fraud, and program integrity, and so many other policies that exist, right? And how those policies have eroded the trust of people experiencing poverty. And we have to remedy that, not just by acknowledgement, but also moving beyond acknowledgement to repair and restitution. And one of those things that we have to prioritize as a community is making sure that we advance a program that provides reparations specifically for Black people, and undoing some of the historic harms that have been done to them and their ancestors that have been perpetuated by public benefits programs. So I have a long list, like I said, and I can put a link in here to my report of so many things that need to change. But one of the starts is really acknowledgement, and then moving past acknowledgement to repair and restitution.
Thank you for that. And your report is linked in the chat, so check that out. I'm already going to make sure I make time to read it. So thank you, Parker. Yolanda, I'm also very interested in your perspective on this question, so I invite you to jump in.
So one of the major things that I will say is proximity. I live in the state of South Carolina. If you don't have a car, you cannot get to an office. That is hands down an issue. Also, in thinking about how people access different offices, most people, they have to take a day off from work just to access these offices. So they're losing wages in order to get the help that they need. Our state also went to a, I call it a cattle call 1-800 number system that opened up at 8 a.m. If you weren't on the phone at 8 a.m., you would probably have to wait 45 minutes to 3 hours to talk to someone about your application. And it would probably be someone elsewhere in the state. It wouldn't even be someone local to you. So I really think that in terms of trying to make the work more efficient, some states have taken the humanity out of what should be a human connection. That people should be able to go into these offices and a caseworker should be able to ask them, what happened that brought you to me? Not what did you do, what happened? And that's something that is really lacking. And I do admit that, at right now, with COVID and all the things that are happening, I feel that in my state specifically, there are fewer and fewer families that are able to access certain benefits because they don't have the transportation for it. And, not every city has a public transportation system. So that's part of the issues with access from my perspective, but not only that, in thinking about how the applications are written. If it's only written in English and Spanish and someone speaks Mandarin, how are they going to know what they're applying for? Also, having a support system for individuals that really need to be walked through the system, because they're not going to know what is right and what is wrong. And a lot of people don't realize that if you qualify for WIC, you may possibly qualify for SNAP. A lot of families that are middle class might not realize that if you have children, you might qualify for the CHIP program for your children to access Medicaid. So these are the little things that I think not only would just awareness help, but going back to where offices were in the same proximity, or even having each individual, like Department of Social Services, DHHS, they share the same system, they get the same information, and they let people know that they qualify for things so that they don't have to jump through multiple hoops.
Yeah, I appreciate kind of a couple of things that I'm hearing, that we really need many welcoming doors, right? That people need different pathways to get to services, and all of them need to be viable and simple and easy to use. And then I'm really appreciating kind of this note around taking a human-centered approach. And one of the things we've been thinking about at Code for America is even flipping the narrative on not you telling me what you're here to apply for, but rather you telling me where you are today, what your situation is, and then I tell you how I can help you. And that flip in how we present what's available in terms of basic needs services may be a pathway to getting at some of this kind of human-centered design. So I appreciate all of those comments. Looking at the clock, we're about 5 minutes from our Q&A session. So I want to encourage folks that are on the line to, think of your questions, get them in the chat. And then I'm going to ask our panelists all to kind of close on this key question. And I'll have Gabriel, you start, then we'll go back to Parker and Yolanda. And so the question is, how can people, voters, consumers, organizers, play a role in ensuring that the safety net, and now I'm going to take on the new language that our basic needs, services, and benefits work the way they want it to, and that all people have access to these resources. Gabriel?
Well, that's a great question. Another one I think we could spend a whole webinar talking about, but I'll try to hit on a few very specific points. I think one is, put a lot of pressure on our local elected officials, really, in my opinion, to stress to keep what's been working through the pandemic in place. And I'll use a couple of specific examples from my neck of the woods out here in New Mexico, out in the Southwest. We saw a lot of policies lax, especially in the context of accessing food. Right, so there weren't nearly as many hoops that families had to jump through. If there was food available, I saw people just getting it in the hands of anybody that rolled up and asked for it. Why aren't we doing that all the time? Why can't we keep a lot of these commonsensical approaches that work in place? So I think stressing to all of us in our networks, right, that our role in this process is often just putting pressure on elected leaders and tell them very, very plainly, hey, this worked in my community. Why are we rolling that back right now? Keep it in place. And I think that's one thing that can be done. Another thing that's been really clear through this webinar is a lot of us are hearing a lot of information for the first time, myself included. I think Yolanda and Parker have educated me on a couple of issues today. I can be better at informing my network and really expanding access to this information, right? Rapidly grows through how we all operate on social media, et cetera. So all of you that are listening into this, I appreciate folks have tagged me and said, hey, do you have a link to this study? Can I get the messaging? We'll get that into your hands because we know you can multiply the power of that effect. And just in closing, I think one thing we didn't get a chance to talk a lot about is the cliff effect, or this worry across the public that if I take advantage of some short-term resources right now of the pandemic, does that mean I'm going to lose my longer-term benefits that I might be very, very reliant on? I know that's been a big issue. We've seen it in our studies. Unfortunately, I've never got a straight answer, whether it's from experts, federal and state agencies themselves on any of this, right? Let's all put pressure on this thing that we know the cliff effect has been a problem well before the pandemic. Let's try to use what we're learning during the pandemic to solve some of these big picture structural issues. And finally, right, let's call structural racism what it is. Right, all of these things that we've seen put in the way of people being able to access basic resources right now, from the biggest one, in my opinion, making all these application processes almost 100% reliant on the internet. We know communities of color don't have high-speed internet, right? We know that. So put pressure on folks. Can there be other avenues, other paths, right? For folks where the internet is working, keep it in place. For those that can't because they don't have access to broadband, let's find better paths. It's not that challenging.
Absolutely, that was great. I know that's right. Preaching. So I would just end on the note that I put the emphasis on us as a policy advocacy community. And I'm going to talk about how we need to grow and change, right? Because I think that's important for us to begin to make space. So this policy advocacy community, even before I started, has usually been overwhelmingly white. And it's time for this space to share power, give up space, make space, and create access for people who have routinely been left out of conversations where change is being made, right? Before I came to this space, when I was just usually regularly working at social services, I had no idea that there was a policy advocacy space where people advocate on behalf of people experiencing poverty, right? And get to talk to legislators, state, local, federal level. I didn't know that as a little Black girl, right? And there hasn't been much space made for little Black girls like me until now. And we have to continue to make space for more diverse groups of people. And we have to continue to make space specifically for people who are experiencing these policies currently or previously, so that they can come and sit at the same tables that we sit at to make decisions, right? And so we also need to prioritize demystifying policy. Anytime that I write something, anytime that I am talking about something, I want my granny to be able to read it, right? I want my family members who are currently right now still receiving public benefits to say, oh my goodness, you are putting a name to something that I have always felt, but I did not know how to say it. I want, you know, someone, when I'm on the block in Baltimore, I live in Baltimore, if I handed it to them on the street, they're like, oh, yes, this makes sense. We have to talk about policy in a way that people can understand, because people don't feel like they can engage in a lot of these conversations when we keep it so high above and so in the weeds, right? So I really want to make sure that we shift power to activists who are currently experiencing the programs. And if we don't prioritize that, we're not going to see the change that we need to see. And we also need to be comfortable with being uncomfortable, because this is a space that has been built on white supremacy like so many other spaces. And when you're dismantling white supremacy and how some things are overly organized and not necessarily accepting of community, it's going to be difficult when you bring community in and now they have a lot to say about some of the things that we're doing that they don't like, right? So in making space, being comfortable with being uncomfortable.
Thank you. And Yolanda, before we go to Q&A, your thoughts?
So 2 things. As stated at the top of the webinar, I work for an organization called Results. And we are a grassroots advocacy organization where we do go and lobby Congress for the things that people need in the country and around the world. So I would say to anyone that's interested, they're intrigued, they want to know how to just get started. Our organization is really good at training individuals. I personally run the Results Fellowship for young adults ages 20 to 35, and I teach them advocacy skills from the ground up. So finding an advocacy home is an amazing thing. And also advocacy has, as Parker said, has largely been a white space. And now that people are ready to advocate for themselves, they're ready to talk about their experiences, we are seeing it become more diversified. So continue to diversify the movement. The other thing is that as Parker stated, having people that experience these programs firsthand, have them sit at that table, because we know that politicians get elected to come up with plans and ideas, but they never have to implement those plans or ideas. Have people sitting at the table that can tell you where the idea may go wrong, and be willing to listen and to take constructive criticism. And the other thing that I will say to advocates that don't often get seats at that table, build your own table. Build your own table and bring people into your table and have those conversations and start writing your own pieces of work. Harness the media. Do what you can to get the information out there, because the conversations that we often hear are that people that live in poverty are lazy and they want handouts, but it's the total opposite. People that are in poverty, 9 times out of 10 already work. They already have 1, 2, maybe 3 jobs. They're doing the best that they can. And at the same time, they have to know public policy. They have to know policy and be policy experts for survival. And that is the one piece that people miss. We have to know what is going on Capitol Hill to know how this is going to adversely affect our communities. So I will say to anyone, link up with an advocacy organization, and also to people that are currently experiencing poverty. If they want to invite you to the table, build your own.
Thank you, Yolanda. I really appreciate this concept of an advocacy home and the idea that, you know, you can create space and bring your expertise to that table. So I appreciate that. We are going to go to some questions from our audience who's joining us today. So I think this first one I'm going to tee up for you, Parker, and then of course, Gabriel and Yolanda, do feel free to jump in. So it's a little bit long, so bear with me. I'm going to read it out for you. When we talk about social safety net programs and the focus lands on Black Americans as the stereotypical recipients, I try to talk about how white and especially rural Americans actually have higher uptake. I do this in an attempt to be destigmatizing racially, but I also don't want to erase the experience of Black Americans and why utilization among that community maybe is a symptom of systemic injustice. And so it's really a delicate balance. And I'm unsure how to approach that destigmatization without downplaying the reasons Black Americans might be in this situation. Parker, a response, what does that bring up for you?
Yes, thank you so much for that question. So for me, it brings up a lot because I recognize that statistically, who receives public benefits more usually are white Americans. However, I think I really do see the point that the person is making about the difficulty of bringing that up and not wanting to erase what Black folks have been through in this country. And that's why in my point earlier that I made, of course, it is important for us to highlight the different types of folks who are receiving public benefits. But the main root thing that we need to get to and really address is where is the stigma coming from, and really destigmatizing receiving public benefits. How, similar to what Yolanda said earlier, how we frame talking about it, right? I often love, if y'all have read many of my pieces, I often start out with saying, receiving, healthcare, food, all of these are basic needs to live and thrive. And we have to get it down to that basic building block, right? Sometimes when we talk about public benefits, it's almost as if this is a luxury. It's not a luxury to have food. It's not a luxury to have, things that you need to live in your basic necessities. So I would just mention, when talking about stigma, really going back to what people's experiences are, right? That we aren't trying to paint the picture of a specific person, because the reality is that people experiencing poverty are not a monolith. So it's not going to be acceptable to now, I'm going to paint it as a white person. I'm going to paint it as a Latinx person. I'm going to paint it as this. No, the reality is that everyone in this country is almost a paycheck away from experiencing it. We are realizing it from this pandemic. We have realized it when there was a government shutdown, right? We have to stop othering people experiencing poverty and recognize that we all play a role, and we all have been very close if we've never experienced it before, and talk about the realities of this economy and talk about the realities of what people are experiencing, and make people feel comfortable in sharing that. Because right now, you don't feel comfortable sharing certain things. I know people will be afraid, when I was a social services worker, to share about certain things they were experiencing for fear of their children being taken, right? For fear of being accused of fraud, for fear of all these accusations that come along with simply experiencing poverty. We criminalize and demonize people for experiencing poverty, not recognizing what happens on the other end, where no one wants to put a face to it, right? So let's just talk about the issues that are happening versus trying to illustrate poverty through showing someone's face or their story, or causing people to experience more pain by trying to put their story out there, when the reality is we shouldn't have to hear the worst thing that's happened to you to legitimize the fact that you're experiencing poverty. I shouldn't have to go to Congress and take people with me for them to lay it all on the line for someone to say, now I finally care about this. That's unacceptable. Right? To be really honest about that, we should be bringing people along with us, talking about not just their experiences, but regarding them as experts based on what they've been through, and that you can talk about policy just as well as I can, even though I have a different title.
Thank you for that. Gabriel, Yolanda, anything to share on that topic? Okay, so Gabriel, I have a follow-up question. Go ahead.
Actually, do have some.
Yes, go ahead. Sorry.
I'm sorry. I'm a little slow on unmuting myself.
Yes.
I think, and I 100% agree with Parker. The one thing that I want people to recognize is that in our country, race-neutral policies never include race. So if you have a race-neutral policy, or if you have a policy that is specifically designed to narrow the reach of a program, but it doesn't mention race, that is an issue in our country. Because automatically the person that reads that is either going to put a brown face to it, or they're going to put a multitude of faces to it, depending on how they think. I do believe wholeheartedly that when we stop trying to make this a Black versus white issue, which sounds so simple, but we make it a human issue, because when we talk about other countries, we talk about human rights and human rights violations. When are we going to start talking about the human rights violations here in our country? When are we going to start talking about the children that do not have access to clean water? When do we start talking about the neighborhoods that don't have grocery stores so they can't get healthy foods? When are we going to start having the conversations about human rights violations? Until we start having those conversations, we will continue to see the Black versus white, the Latino versus Vietnamese. It will always be someone versus someone. We need to scale it back and say, these are human rights violations that we need to tackle in our own country. Until then, we can honestly say, like Parker said, any American in this country can be one paycheck away from poverty and not even realize it. So we have to start having those conversations, and we have to start deepening those conversations and getting to the point where we recognize that sometimes when you try to omit race from policy, you are doing more harm than you are good. And it's truly by design, because that's how white supremacy works. It's very subtle. It doesn't show itself immediately. It shows itself down the line. So we need to start recognizing where it's going to pop up at, or start having those conversations about human rights.
Thank you. Yeah, the need for intentionality definitely coming out in your comments. We are closing in on our time, and I'm about to ask Gabriel another big question, recognizing that we only have a few minutes, but I'm going to do it anyway. Gabriel, you know, in your comments, you talked a little bit about, and you brought up some very timely examples related to pandemic aid, and how we should think about some of these flexibilities and you know, what stays in place as we enter recovery from that economic collapse, if you will. So let me ask you, we saw that many communities of color struggled to access pandemic related aid. What caused the disparity, but even more importantly, maybe with the limited time, how do we ensure an equitable economic recovery moving forward? So if we are trying to capitalize on this moment in time, how do we ensure that that recovery is equitable moving forward?
Well, I mean, like you noted, I mean, speaking to this, right, would take quite a while, but I'm going to give it a shot. I think one of the things is recognizing that the obstacles and challenges were nuanced based on the lived experience of the community that we're talking about. So for example, Native American communities, right, oftentimes weren't able to apply for the same streams of fundings as everybody else, given their unique standing in the US. But most of the population didn't understand how that process worked. We also found that consistently across groups, it tends to be the case that those of us that are more well-resourced are capable of navigating through all the complex systems to figure out, A, am I eligible? B, if I'm eligible, how do I actually go about acquiring these funds? Whether that's at the community level, at the aggregate, or the individual level, that in and of itself is by definition not equitable, right? So we have to figure out how to meet people where they are, right? I've heard from, I'll give you one kind of close with one case point, tangible solution that we've heard time and time again from families. How about putting together some type of peer-oriented mechanism or infrastructure where we do some light training for individuals? They don't have to go to law school to be, up to be able to help families, but give them some basic training on how to navigate the system, because we're hearing that from a lot of folks. They'd much rather talk to somebody who's a peer that has navigated this successfully than to wait in line to talk to a government bureaucrat, which we've heard from our colleagues is a huge problem. So how about doing that? Whether it's specifically looking at legal resources, because unfortunately, one thing we haven't talked about, many of our families across the country have gotten themselves into big situations that started off very small that now require litigation. Our people can't afford a lawyer. And unfortunately, there's not enough supply to go around right now to meet the growing demand. But we heard from a lot of families directly and service providers that if they got a little bit of training to help at least connect folks to the resources that already exist, they would be willing to do that. And finally, our surveys has consistently found that peers that have actually successfully gotten access to some of these resources are the most trusted messengers So it makes sense that we pair community with the folks that they already trust rather than hoping they'll come to us. Long-winded answer, I know, but hopefully that gives some important context there.
I think that is just the right answer. And like every answer during this webinar has gotten me thinking so much, and we're at time. So I do want to wrap up here and thank you all. Time is our most precious non-renewable resource, and you gave it to us. So we appreciate that. And thank you for really a thought-provoking conversation. Every question could have been its own webinar, and you all managed to get us thinking really in succinct nuggets. And I took something away from every one of those questions. So I appreciate that. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Maria Castillo from the Food and Society at the Aspen Institute to close us out.
Hi, everybody, and thank you so much to our moderator, Alexis Fernandez Garcia, and panelists Parker Gilkison, Yolanda Gordon, and Gabriel Sanchez for such an important conversation today. I don't know about you, but I had chills and I was clapping. So thank you. Much appreciation to our interpreters, Diego Pons and Vidia Sosa of Community Language Cooperative. And thank you to my colleagues and my friends at Share Our Strength, who with us at Food and Society at the Aspen Institute produce conversations on food justice. And I also want to say thank you to like 500 of you who joined us today. We appreciate your questions, observations, and eager participation. So please note that an email will go out as soon as this recording is posted to our website. And we have something new developing at Conversations on Food Justice. Starting with the next session, we will host a 30-minute fireside chat immediately following the program. This will be a more informal conversation and offer the opportunity to share a few reflections, answer questions we didn't get to, and have a thoughtful discussion on what we just heard. The first session will be hosted by Elliot Gaskins from Share Our Strength and Katie Workman, philanthropist, chef, author, and Share Our Strength Leadership Council member. Visit us at our websites or keep the conversation going with us on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram at Aspen Food and No Kid Hungry VA. Thank you.